social issues that were occurring during the 1920s. So the previous lecture video kind of painted this nice picture of an economically prosperous nation with growing wealth and access to consumer goods. And that is true, right? But it's not the whole picture, right? It could be a little misleading because this prosperity was not for every single person or not every group of people. And so, in particular, right, there was this prosperity, but there was a growing income gap between workers and management. So the blue collar workers at the factory, their wages weren't going up as much as the wages of those white collar, managers in the factory and the accountants and the people in the offices, right? They were making more and more money. Their wages were going up higher, and so they experienced more of the economic benefits of the 1920s than that blue collar working class group did. Certain industries in the nation, particularly the railroad industry, was really struggling, and in fact, many railroad companies are going to be going bankrupt. They essentially had expanded too. There was too many of them, and they all had expanded too rapidly. And so, by the 1920s, there's tens of thousands of railroad lines throughout the nation, miles of railroad lines throughout the nation, and and there's these competing companies which cause them to drop their prices to gain more customers, but over time, eventually it becomes unsustainable because you have such a large infrastructure that you have to upkeep and maintain, but you're not making enough money off of it, and so that's going to lead to issues in the railroad companies. One group of Americans who were suffering significantly during this time period, but was kind of going unreported or underreported, were farmers, the rural farmers out in the Midwest or out in the West Coast, that area, um, because new farming techniques and new farming technologies, tractors and things like that, lead to an increase in crops being grown. But just like any other commodity or any other good, when the quantity of it goes up, the value of it goes down, right? Because there's more of it, so you can't charge as much, and so farmers have a surplus of crops, and eventually, for many farmers, it becomes not profitable to grow things because they're growing too many of something, and it won't sell for a profit. Um, and over time, many farmers throughout the 1920s are forced to foreclose on their farms and move to the cities or move somewhere else, right? It's not a good picture for those farmers, or many of them. 1920s, going back to the previous lecture activity or lecture video about the modern marketing, this idea of an installment plan or kind of pay as you go type thing um, grows in popularity during the 1920s. People marketed these goods like vacuum cleaners or washing machines, and they want them, but many people can't afford to buy them outright or at once. And so what they do is they buy it on credit, like essentially a credit card, and they pay it back over time, pay it back in installments. This is all good and great, but when, say, an economic recession happens and people lose their jobs, now they can't afford to pay it back, right? And so a lot of people become trapped in debt from these installment plans. In addition to that, another major issue that was an element of the Roaring Twenties is nativism. And we've heard this term a couple times before, so we should know what it means. And during this time, there was this real sense of, immigrants were kind of altering the fabric of what it means to be an American. There was many white Anglo-Saxon Americans who wanted to keep kind of the status quo and wanted to limit or reverse the immigration trends happening. And on top of that, you have after the end of World War One, this real isolationist tendency in the United States, right? That we should remain out of foreign affairs. Let's not get involved, and that's harder to do when there's so many foreigners in the country with their own, allegiances or bringing in their own opinions about what's happening throughout the world into America. And so, actually, during this time period, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan that we mentioned in the Reconstruction Unit, sees a resurgence in popularity during this time. And at its height in 1924, KKK membership was at 4.5 million men, right? White men, white Protestant men. I say white Protestant men because the KKK is not just a racist organization. They did not just dislike African Americans or blacks. They did not like Jews. They did not like Roman Catholics. And did not like most immigrants in general. And they wanted kind of all those people out of the country. And to some extent, these nativist, these KKK members get what they want in some regards when the quota system is passed that limits the number of immigrants from certain nations, right? Based on previous population numbers, they can have a small percentage that come into the country in future years. And so that drastically limits Southern and Eastern Europeans from entering the country. which would be largely the Catholics and the Jews who were coming in from places like Italy or Poland or Russia. Right, so it was a highly restrictive immigration act. It decided the number of immigrants from each country could be 2% of the numbers living in the U.S. Based on the 1890 census, right? And so in the 1890 census, it's overwhelming Irish and Germans and starting to become more Russian. And so it takes just 2% of that number for each of those immigrant groups. So for example, if in 1890 there were only 100 Italians that immigrated to America, that means from 1924 on, only 2 new Italian immigrants could arrive each year, right? Obviously the number is bigger than 100, but that just kind of help you understand what's happening there. And it drastically reduces it so that by 1927, there's only 150,000 people immigrating to the U.S. each year. If you go back to the 1850s, 1860s, during the potato famine and things like that, there were almost over a million immigrants a year coming into the country. So this is a dramatic decrease. Interestingly enough, though, this quota system only applied to nations in the Eastern Hemisphere, so Europe, Asia, Africa. It did not apply to Latin America, and so theoretically, Latin Americans could come in larger numbers, and they start to, particularly from Mexico. And also, Canadians are not part of this, so large numbers of Canadians continue to immigrate as well. Right, so we can kind of see the change over time here of these immigrants. In 1921, before the Immigration Act, right, you can see that the largest number of immigrants are Italians. And if we look now to 1929, Italians are very small number, right, because this is the result of the Immigration Act here. But you can see places like Canada, it's a very little change, and in Mexico, it's actually an increase in 1921 to 1929, right, because they don't have to adhere to that quota system that the Italians or the Polish or the Germans have to. Another group that we don't talk too much about in this class, but they're existing, they're here in the United States, are the Native Americans. And thousands of them actually serve in World War I. They respond pretty patriotically to this call, and so it helps kind of change Americans' perception of these Native American groups. And so, by this point in 1924, then a law is passed called the Indian Citizenship Act, which gave citizenship status to over 100,000 Native Americans. Right up to this point, Native Americans were not considered citizens. Right, they could not vote in elections, and they did not receive any of the benefits it would mean to be a citizen. So it's interesting that in one end we see in 1924 a nativist kind of racist law is passed to limit immigrants. In that same year, though, we have kind of a positive trend on how Americans treated Native Americans. So it's interesting that it's not necessarily all these racist attitudes it's not uniform, right, in the United States, which is important to remember. There's always so many different things going on. And finally, by 1948, you'll have all Native Americans finally gain the right to vote. Kind of the last major social threat during this time period, or perceived social threat during this time period, is communism and the Red Scare. So the fear of communism is this political system where the ideology is that the working class will overthrow the government, establish their own government, and rule with complete power. They'll abolish private property, and the government will direct economic production so that so the working class benefits more. And the capitalist class, the wealthy landowners, the wealthy businessmen won't benefit as much. Communism is a reaction to capitalism. Capitalism, the system of Harding and Coolidge, where you have this idea of let businesses run the show kind of thing. Communism is a complete reaction to that, right? And it gained some popularity in the United States at this time, but overwhelmingly Americans are not supportive of communism, and that's what leads to this Red Scare. So the Red Scare began when a man named Vladimir Lenin organizes a revolution in Russia. This happens during the First World War. So at one point in World War I in 1917, the Russians actually surrender and they withdraw from the war. Because they do that because there was a revolution that happened that overthrew the government that was engaged in the war. And now you have Vladimir Lenin, who now is the communist leader of Russia. They renamed Russia to the Soviet Union, the USSR. And so there's a scare in America that the communist groups in America might try to do the same thing in the United States. Um, Russia and the United States were at completely different points in their development. The United States was prosperous, well off, not in the midst of a war being fought on its territory. Russia was poor, desperate, and people were literally starving during the war, and so there's a very different situation. But nonetheless, people in America were scared that the communists were going to infiltrate the United States. And this is something that's going to happen, pop up this Red Scare again and again throughout the 1940s, 50s, and so on. And so there are efforts to get rid of communists, socialists, and anarchists within the government and within the United States. Right? Just to kind of quickly clarify, communists and socialists are not the same exact thing, although they have some similarities. So communists wanted to overthrow the capitalist system with a revolution, an armed revolution. They wanted to abolish private property. They did not believe in God, their atheist ideology. And the workers control the means of production. So they control the wealth that leads to factories and things like that. Socialists wanted a stronger welfare state and protection for workers. They wanted greater regulation of the economy, but not necessarily complete control of the economy by the government. They wanted to operate through the existing system, right, through the democratic system. They did not want to overthrow it. And then there's another group, a really radical group of people known as anarchists. And anarchists oppose any form of government. They wanted anarchy, which essentially means chaos, right? I don't know what that would look like, right? How do you have a society without a government? But that was their goal. And there's a really famous example of kind of this Red Scare and this the fear that came around it. And it was these two Italian immigrants, last names Sacco and Vanzetti, in 1920, who were accused of murder. All the evidence in the trial was circumstantial, right? It was kind of like a he said, she said type thing. It was no hardcore evidence connecting them to the crime. Within the course of the case, the judge even made some not appropriate comments, kind of showing his clouded judgment, his bias towards these two Italian immigrants. And the suspects, Sacco and Vanzetti, were able to provide legitimate alibis. But despite all this, they were sentenced to death, and they were executed. There were lots of protests, and eventually kind of these two were exonerated because many people felt they were being persecuted for their beliefs, because these two were noted anarchists, and for being immigrants because they were Italian Americans. And so this is a kind of a famous example of that nativist and Red Scare kind of merging together during the Roaring '20s here. And lastly, right, during the 1920s, there is a lot of labor unrest, right? These labor unions that formed all the way back in the Progressive Era, the Gilded Age, still exist, and many of them are actually growing in power during this time. And so a famous one was the Boston police strike. The police officers in Boston went on strike. They wanted the right to unionize. They wanted wage increases. But they were unsuccessful because ultimately the governor at the time, a man named Calvin Coolidge, who will be the future president of the United States, refuses to adhere to these things, does not want them to unionize, does not want to pay them more. And he fires the entire police force in Boston and hires new people. Right? There's no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. And in fact, this mentality still exists, right? So in New York City, for example, today, if you work in a factory, you can go on strike, but it's technically illegal for police officers, firefighters, anyone else who's deemed essential to go on strike because it's deemed a threat to kind of the public welfare. So this is kind of a famous example of this labor unrest. So they were not successful in this case, but it does show the growing power of unions, the growing organizational skills that they have, which is important. A more successful example would be in 1919, so not technically the Roaring '20s, but close enough, right? The mine workers, United Mine Workers of America, had a new leader, a man named John Lewis, and he called for a strike, which was so successful because they actually successfully got almost a 30% wage increase, which is really dramatic. Generally, though, the government was opposed to union efforts, and so if the government was opposed to it and did not kind of recognize the legal authority of unions, the unions did not have much of a chance. It's going to take another decade or so for that to start to change. In the 1930s, unions gained greater recognition. And because of the economic situation, which is generally beneficial, because of restrictive government policies, because of immigrant workforces, the union numbers actually start to decline in the 1920s. So I might have misspoke in the previous slide saying it went up. My apologies. It actually starts to decline. But that will change in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, once the Great Depression happens, this trend reverses because people suddenly see the greater need for unions in American society. And so while the first lecture activity talked about kind of the benefits of the Roaring Twenties, this is looking here at the pitfalls or the not so great elements of the Roaring Twenties, right? Because every decade has its ups and its downs, and so it's important to kind of highlight both of those. So we're going to stop there for now, and we'll pick up with another related topic next time.